We have now come to the third book of our Pentateuch studies, the book of Leviticus. The book often gives people a sense where it is very boring because many of the instructions, many of the things that is mentioned in the book of Leviticus actually have no direct relation to what we are used to today. A lot of people feel that this is a book of the past and there's no application, nothing significant that you can get out of the book. In fact, this is one of the books that most people prefer not to read in their Old Testament. And today we want to really start our journey through the book of Leviticus, and we want to unearth why this book is important. Why is it even in the middle of our Pentateuch? When we do this, right, we must understand that the book of Leviticus is housed within this journey between the land of Egypt all the way to the land of Canaan, from the land of bondage to the land of promise. So you can see that the book of Leviticus actually is right in the middle of that journey. In the book of Exodus, you have just left the land of bondage and you are now proceeding out of it. And you meet a point in the middle where you are at Mount Sinai, where you encounter God. And then when you go to the book of Numbers, you are actually leaving that mountain and you're now proceeding towards your land of promise. And the book of Leviticus is actually written right smack in the middle at Mount Sinai, where it represents our encounter with God and how this will make a difference in our journey through the rest of our life. So if you remember your previous study, what happened in Exodus? We know of the 10 plagues, how God delivered Israel out of Egypt. We know of the passing of the Red Sea, the crossing of the Red Sea. And then they journeyed in a long time, all the way, about close to 3 months, 3 months period, all the way until they reached the foot of Mount Sinai. There, we heard about the famous story of the golden calf, where they rebelled against God. They break their first commandment, which is not to create an idol. But God forgave them, and eventually the glory of God. At the end of the book of Exodus, what you read is that the glory of God descended upon the tabernacle that they have just built, and now God will start living in the midst of His people. And therefore, at the end of Exodus, or in the beginning of Leviticus, what you have is that Israel is still at Mount Sinai. It's roughly around a time of 1 to 2 month period while they were at Mount Sinai with the whole entire tabernacle ready. The presence of God has descended, and within that period of time, they are at Mount Sinai and they now have the tabernacle. 2 months later, in the book of Numbers, they would have packed up and they would have left Mount Sinai. So very likely, all these instructions that happened within Leviticus was probably recorded the moment they were given to Moses, and Moses painstakingly just record down all these instructions related to the tabernacle as well as all the sacrifices required of the tabernacle. And therefore, it is usually commonly held that the book was written shortly after the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus was written after they came out along the journey, and the book of Leviticus was written at Mount Sinai before they set off towards the promised land. So this is how we're going to cover through the book of Leviticus. We're going to study through the book of Leviticus in 4 short sessions. The first session will focus on this sacrificial system that we have been introduced to. There's now this idea that Israelites need to do sacrifices if they want to approach God. The second session, we will talk about the need to cleanse the tabernacle, the need to purify. What's this whole atonement all about? Session 3 will talk about how this therefore applies to us in our personal holiness, whereas session 4 will extend that to corporate holiness. The book of Leviticus is actually simply about God's holy presence. So today, as we go on, as we start this session number 1, we're going to talk about the requirements. The first segment is the requirements of these sacrifices. God is going to introduce to Moses and through Moses to the rest of the people, now that the tabernacle is among us, now that God's presence stays within the people of God, there is a need to change or to adjust the way you approach God's holy presence. There's a way that you are supposed to come near to God in a way that reflects the right posture of your hearts. So a lot of time when people look at sacrifices, we often think that it is just about offering the things that God wants, whatever God wants, I'll just give it to Him. They fail to understand that all these sacrifices that is instructed for the Israelite, it was meant to teach them something. God in His scripture, in Psalm 50 verse 10, I mentioned the idea that if I really need those sacrifices, I can get it on my own. I don't need you. I don't need you to bring me the sacrifices if I truly need them. I required those sacrifices because you are the one that needed it, not me. So in this whole first segment, the book of Leviticus, chapter 1 all the way to chapter 7, it deals with the sacrifices. This is the first time we were introduced to the 5 sacrifices that the people of God had to bring. And this segment is divided into 2 parts. The first part deals with what the people must bring, and the second portion deals with instructions to the priest. What are you to do when the people bring these sacrifices? So very simply, let me quickly just run through some of these sacrifices that most of us have heard before, but maybe we'll just run through a quick rundown so that you understand what it represents. The first to be introduced is actually this thing called the burnt offering. In chapter 1, burnt offering. This is an offering that's very common. In fact, this is the most common offering that all Israelites must be familiar with. It is offered twice a day, every single day in the tabernacle or in the temple later. Okay, the burnt offering. The idea of the burnt offering, the word burn basically means ascending. It describes how the thing is so burnt that it will create smoke. And the smoke will just keep on rising and rising. So because of that, they name their whole offering after the idea of ascending, burnt. So that's why we get an English idea called burnt, totally burnt. So the whole idea of the burnt offering is meant to symbolize the total dedication of a person. When a person totally entrusts himself to God, or a total dedication or consecration. So usually you offer burnt offering as a symbol of your commitment to God, as a commitment to God. And it's important that here you start to see the idea that you are instructed a certain kind of animal that you are offering to God. You can't just offer anything you want. You are supposed to offer something. And this is a good time to introduce the idea that, remember, when you read the Bible, or especially in the book of Leviticus, you are not to infer that God is trying to teach something about gender, about community in that way. For example, there is a clear sign that you are only supposed to offer male animals, young male animals without defect, young male animals. And the reason is very simple, because reality is that in the ancient culture, they really feel that the male animal is more precious than the female, because one male animal can easily impregnate many females. So those were the culture of that time. This is in no way saying, right, that God is trying to teach or endorse the idea that, oh, the males are more important than the female. God is using some cultural ideas and values of their time in order to communicate something. The point that God was trying to say here at the end of in all those sacrifices is that you must sacrifice something that you deem as precious. So the burnt offering represents an offering of a male, something that you deem as very important, very precious, and yet you are offering it as a symbol of your total dedication to God. So there was a lot of sacrifices. There are different things you can bring based on what you can afford, but all represent your commitment to God. For those who are a bit more well off, you can offer a bigger animal. For those who can't, you can offer a bird, all symbols of your commitment to God. That's the burnt offering. The next is the grain offering. The grain offering is something like your tribute, your thanksgiving. Okay, it is something that you're supposed to bring in order to express thanksgiving for what God has given to us. You celebrate the harvest, you celebrate the bringing in of the harvest that you have, and you give an offering. Remember, this is not required in any way. This is all voluntary. You bring to God as a voluntary sign of thanksgiving. God, thank you for the harvest that you've given to us. This is a little bit similar to, in modern day, what we call a love offering or thanksgiving offering. So this is the grain offering. This is the one that left, some parts of it will be burned, will be given to the Lord, and the rest of it will be given to the priest. Third, you will have this very strange offering called the fellowship offering. We are a bit unsure what the word actually means, but based on the description of what goes on, it is going to be a party. There's a time after the offering where everybody gather and have a celebration, and most likely it is meant to describe and to bring out the idea that we celebrate the relationship, the good relationship between us and God, and then we have a celebration. So it will be very similar to modern day, like the way we celebrate wedding anniversaries. Right? Do you realize that in the same way you celebrate wedding anniversaries because of a good relationship that you share? You are not trying to celebrate an anniversary in order to have a good relationship with your spouse. You have a good relationship with your spouse, and once a year you may take that opportunity to celebrate that relationship. So fellowship offering is something along that line. You have a good relationship with God and you want to sometimes take opportunities, spur of the moment. You just want to hold a banquet in order to celebrate the relationship that you have with God. So that's fellowship offering. The last two is where it gets a little bit confusing because of the way it is often translated in our Bible. It's difficult to translate. Most often our Bible translates it as sin offering because of the original root word that was used to describe this. But the reality is this, the difficulty is, if this is just a regular sin offering, something to do with sin, then it actually overlaps with a lot of other sacrifices like the reparation offering, like the burnt offering. And in fact, this offering is often required for things that has totally no relationship to sin. For example, when a lady have her monthly period, you're supposed to offer this offering. When you give birth to a child, you're supposed to offer this offering, but it is very difficult for us to come to terms with where is the sin in all this? Where is the sin in all this? In fact, even when a husband and a wife have sex with one another, they are also unclean and they also need this offering. So where is the sin in all this? So because of that, and because of the way it is used, the better translation is actually purification offering. Purification. So that means, right, that in some way the tabernacle has been polluted. Not necessarily sinned against, but polluted. Of course, sin is included in the pollution. When you sin, you obviously violate the holiness of the tabernacle, but there are also other things that God decided. These are also things that will violate. For example, the touching of a dead body of an animal. These are all things that God deemed that will violate the holiness of the tabernacle and therefore require a purification offering. So you notice a purification offering will make better sense compared to a sin offering. And in this offering, the unusual thing is, it is not, you don't bring the animal depending on what you prefer. You are told that if you are a priest, for example, you are supposed to use a bull. If you're a regular ruler, a Levite, you're supposed to bring a male goat. And subsequently, so on and so forth. Based on your stature within the community, different animals will represent you if you violate the holiness of God. So this will be the purification offering. Then the last one is the reparation offering. This sometimes people use it as a compensation offering, but it is better understood in a way whereby you violate the holy things of God. This is a little bit similar to modern day where you are charged with slander. Okay, when you slander someone, you violated my reputation, so I can bring you to court, and so that you repay because of your violation to my reputation. I didn't lose anything, right? I didn't lose a goat, I didn't lose my money, but my holy reputation was actually affected. So in this way, this offering is meant when you violate the holiness of God in some way. For example, if you touch the food that you're not supposed to touch, where you touch the tithe when you're not supposed to do, you dedicated something to God and you brought it back home, and things along that line, or you violate the name of God, you use the name of God in vain. All these are examples where you actually violated God's reputation, God's holiness, God's holy name. So those are the situations where you're supposed to bring this offering. Whatever thing that you have violated in, you're supposed to pay back. and you are supposed to top up a 20% extra. Okay, whatever you have violated, you top up 20, you return and you top up 20% extra. And some of you wondering, 20%, that's quite chill. Okay, the reason why it's 20 because this is voluntary. Basically, you surrender. Okay, you are not caught and you're not brought to court and you're not being accused. You actually recognize that you have violated God's holy things and you voluntarily bring this to God. So because of that voluntary surrender nature, because of that voluntary repentance, so therefore the punishment is kept to the minimum, 20% because of that violation. So all these are the 5 major sacrifices that the people of Israel were introduced to. Nothing fancy. You notice it's a lot simpler. The whole entire sacrificial system is a lot simpler compared to what we know of other ancient cultures. It is very straightforward. Every kind of offering, just 5 kinds, and every kind of offering is specifically related to how the people, the worshipper, is related to God. In all these sacrifices, it is the worshipper that is supposed to bring the sacrifices. He cannot delegate it to someone else. He cannot say, hey, my servant, can you bring the sacrifices to the tabernacle for me? No. The person who is the one offering, the person who is the one who violated God's holiness, the one who is unclean, that very person, no matter how, at what level of society you are, that person is the one that must bring his or her own sacrifice to the tabernacle. He or she is supposed to be the one who will do the killing of the animal, the draining of the blood, including the chopping out of the animal. Because this is your responsibility. The goal is to get the person to feel that this is what you offered. You are responsible for your own offering. The only time when the priest takes over, which is the next portion, chapter 6 all the way to chapter 7. The only time when the priest takes over is where you have to deal with blood, or you are talking about how the parts of the animals are being placed on the altar. You chop it up, you leave it there, and the priest come along and arrange it in a way that is appropriate for it to be placed on the altar. The priest only come in at the end. Okay, so this is something happened. So the next portion therefore deals with what the priests are to do. What are the priests supposed to do when the people bring along those kind of offering because of their desires, or because they have violated God, or they have polluted God's presence? So what are the priests supposed to do with all these things that they receive? So as before, you talk about your burnt offering, your grain offering, your purification. The interesting thing here is that instead of going in the same order that you see in the earlier segment, in this second segment, the fellowship offering is placed last, and it's the longest. The fellowship offering, the instructions concerning the fellowship offering is the longest, and it also is placed at the end. And the main reason is that the fellowship offering is the most complicated for the priest. Whatever is offered, he's supposed to, okay, this part is given to this person, that part is given to that person. How do I arrange the sacrifices on the altar? How do I burn? And eventually, who gets what part? See, that is a lot more complicated compared to a burnt offering. Just put the sacrifice on the altar and burn it until nothing is left. It is very straightforward. So for the fellowship offering, this is the one where everyone is involved. The people gets a part of it, God gets his part, and then the priest get his portion. And this is also the time where we are introduced to a very interesting idea that the fats of the sacrifice belong to God. No one is supposed to touch the fats of the sacrifice. Sometimes people would joke that, wow, see, I belong to God because of all this excess meat around me. Okay, but that is not what is meant. Okay, unfortunately, the word fats that is described in your Old Testament doesn't describe what we now call the layer of meat that makes our body slightly off shape. The idea of fats is actually the internal fats. Okay, this is basically a layer of fatty meat, right, that actually surround the internal organs. So when you actually kill and sacrifice the sacrificial animal, when you try to take out the internal organs, there will be a layer of fats that actually cover his internal organs. That is the fats that the Bible is talking about. The Bible is not talking about the meat kind of fat. It's talking about the layer of fat that guards the internal organs. So what is this? Why is this so special? Apparently, right, this is a way of communicating to the people of God that the internal of who a person is, that person belongs to God. Yes, the body, you can take the body for sacrifice, you can take the meat for eating, you can take the blood for your sacrificial ritual, but the soul, the very life of that person or the animal belongs only to God, and no one can violate that essence. So the very being, so that is meant to be a symbol of the very being and life of the being, of the creation. Okay, so there's different kinds of sacrifices, and with that, the whole entire sacrifices will finish. There's a lot of instructions here, and the goal at the end of the day, right? Remember, the sacrifices was given as object lessons. That means they didn't know about how to approach God. They just came out of Egypt. They have no idea who this God is, and they just know that this God requires something. It appears to be very similar to what they are used to, because remember, a lot of pagan religion also requires sacrifices. But the reason those sacrifices are supposed to be brought is very different. In the ancient world, most often than not, sacrifices were required because the gods required the meat. But in the book of Leviticus, the instruction is you bring this because you need forgiveness. You need forgiveness. So in this portion, we know that the whole entire sacrificial system is not, it sounds bloody, it sounds a lot of death, a lot of very meticulous, but what it is really trying to symbolize is just these two very basic ideas. The attitudes of approaching God. That when you approach God, there's this attitude that you bring. Because all the sacrifices are divided into two major parts. The first three, your burnt, your grain, and your fellowship offering, are mostly voluntary. That means you bring it if you want to bring it. No one can force you to bring those offerings. Those are all voluntary offering. Whereas reparation and your purification offering, you have to bring it because you acknowledge that you have violated God's holiness. In fact, every single time you approach God's presence, you are supposed to bring a purification offering. It is understood that you would have violated God's holy presence in one way or another. You bring first. This is a bit like our practice last time, right? Where you are trained or you are taught to have a time of confession before you sleep every night. Then you'll be wondering, but I have not sinned, what's there to confess? And then your leaders will tell you, just prepare that time, because I'm sure when you quieten down your heart, you will notice things that you need to repent of. So in that way, right, that was the way that the people of Israel was taught about the holiness of God. When I come to God, I must always come with an humble acknowledgement that I'm inadequate, that I'm not holy, I have violated God's holiness. I don't come to God thinking that there's no requirement. I come to God knowing that I don't meet His standard. I am humble and I recognize that. Yet at the same time, I also come to God with a very willing expression of my gratitude. So that's the way the two kinds of offering is trying to draw the people. When you come to God, remain humble. Remember, it is God's grace that you are able to come, and yet come to God being willing to express your gratitude. So that was the whole entire message concerning the simple message behind the sacrifices. Okay, so something for us to think about as we look at the sacrifices. The sacrifices is not about what we need to bring to God or what God requires. It is really about whether the people of God will pay careful attention when we approach God. Okay, that whole idea that you cannot take God's holiness for granted. You cannot just casually walk into God's presence. You need to be very careful if you want to approach God's presence. Because without these ideas as the foundation of the whole entire sacrificial system, the whole idea about Jesus having to die, having to enter the temple, all this doesn't make sense. It starts with the idea that no one can casually enter the presence of God. The second portion, very quickly, we will just wrap up the second portion. The second portion of this focuses on, now that you have sacrifices, you need a priest, right? All the while we mentioned there's a priest. This is basically the instructions concerning this priest. Chapter 8 to chapter 10. What are we to do with this priesthood? So these 3 chapters very simply just talk about how the priests were ordained, were selected and appointed for their tasks. Chapter 9 talk about how their ministry started. And then chapter 10 talks about the failures of the very first priest. The failures of the sons, the 2 sons of Aaron, and how, and through that encounter, how we know the priests are supposed to behave. So in the beginning, chapter 8, it describes how the ordination happened, how the people must prepare the anointment of the tabernacle and the anointment, ordination of the priest. Subsequently, after the whole ceremony is ended at the end of chapter 8, from that point onward, the priesthood will take over Moses. Because in chapter 8, Moses actually acts like a priest to do all these sacrifices. But from chapter 8 onwards, this whole responsibility of standing in the presence of God to represent the people is now passed on to the priest. The priest now will take that responsibility. So chapter 9 then talks about the priest doing this for the first time. Their first time doing all the sacrifices. I'm quite sure they are a little bit anxious. So they have to offer the offering on their behalf, because to recognize that they are impure, they offer the purification offering for themselves, and then they offer purification offering on behalf of the people. So all of this is describing the idea that the priest now is taking over the ministry. And chapter 9 verse 22 to 24, we have a very symbolic picture where the presence of God come down, fire. I'm quite sure when you think about the fire coming down and consuming the sacrifices, most of us remember Elijah and his wrestling with the prophets of Baal. So this is the same idea where the holy fire of God came down and consumed the sacrifices as a symbol that the priests are accepted. The priesthood is accepted now. From today onward, they will function as God's a mediator towards the people. And that's all good and well. Unfortunately, right after this, you have the description, the story about the first failure of the priest. And the failures are the 2 oldest sons of Aaron. Aaron had 4 children, 4 sons, and the first 2 violated. We are not sure what they did. The Bible describes it as strange fire. Basically, anything that's strange in this context means that they did not bring the right fire to the incense. That there were careful instruction about what to do with that. They did not follow, and therefore they offered something that is not authorized. Okay, unauthorized fire. So strange fire simply means that something, a way of bring the fire, maybe it is because the coal that was for the fire was not the right one. Maybe they brought the fire at the wrong time. They brought the fire with the wrong instrument. So whatever it is, it meant that they did not follow the careful instruction of God. And therefore they were struck dead. And the whole, we are not sure why, as member, but there is a hint, because right after the event, there was a ban on all priests on drinking, not getting drunk, drinking at all when you are ministering in the tabernacle. So very likely, right, the 2 older priests drank. And because of their lack of soberness, they did something wrong. They were careless with God's presence, and therefore they were judged. So there was now a lifelong ban on all the priests. Whenever they need to step into the tabernacle, no drinking at all. Okay, no drinking at all whenever, so that you maintain soberness and you can be very careful to distinguish your role, clean, unclean, authorized, unauthorized, and you are able to follow the instructions and then teach the people about all the instruction they have to follow in order to be correct before the eyes of God. So that's the whole idea, the judgment of the priest. So the priests therefore have a very heavy responsibility, because they are representing God's holiness, and they are also supposed to teach the people about God's holiness. So the people of the priesthood, therefore, from that point onward, is understood that they will be called to a higher standard. The priesthood is understood from this whole account as the mediator of God's holiness. God's holiness cannot be seen. But when we look at what the priests, because they are nearer to the presence of God and the kind of things that they are not allowed to do, you start to realize that, so the concept is the nearer the person is to the presence, the holy presence of God, the requirement of that person actually heightened. So the priesthood became the mediator, the middleman, to mediate the presence of God to the people. So in the whole account, we understand that the priest is both a representative as well as someone who is acceptable in the presence of God. That means before the people of God, the priest is a representation of God. That's the reason why the priest actually in his original attire is often someone who dresses in a very bright colored, a lot of gold, a lot of very beautiful. He's not allowed to keep his hair unkempt. He's supposed to dress in a way that is appropriate because he's supposed to present to the people, this is the glory of God. This is the glory of God. He's someone who represents God to the people and someone who needs to make sure he carries himself in a way that's appropriate before God. Yet at the same time, whenever the priest has to enter the Holy of Holies or the priest, he actually has to dress down. He cannot wear that kind of attire, like very flashy attire. He cannot wear that into the holy place. Why? Because in the holy place, you are no longer representing God to the people. You are representing the people to God. And he has to dress down and wear just a white simple linen to symbolize his humanity and to symbolize his humility. He dresses white, dresses simple in order to stand before God, because in the presence, in the holy presence of God, no one can have the right to be flashy. So therefore, he comes as simply someone who has to be acceptable. Someone who is acceptable. So this is the priesthood, the understanding of the priesthood. And we know that in this whole discussion about the presence of God, they start to have this idea where the space is actually now used as an analogy of God's holiness. So now you can think of holiness as the very center of the Holy of Holies. That's the very center. And as you go nearer and nearer to the Holy of Holies, as you go nearer, the person who is now entering a space that is nearer to the most holy place will face stricter requirements. So therefore, you're talking about the pagans who is outside the camp, very little requirements. When you are Israelites within the camp of Israel, you have some more requirements in order to stay within the camp. If you're a Levite, you have a heavier requirement because you are now working in the courtyards. If you're a priest, you are able to enter into the holy place. There's a lot more stricter requirement of what you can or cannot do. And if you are a high priest, you will get to enter the most holy place and the requirements of your life will be stricter. So the people who are nearer, as you go nearer to the presence of God, the requirements for your life actually heighten. So this is meant as an object lesson to help the people of Israel understand God's holy presence demand purity. The nearer you want to step within, nearer to the presence of God, the requirement that's of us will heighten. So you can either stay far away, or if you draw near, there must be a heightened requirement because of His holiness. And then in the book, in this portion, it therefore deals with the idea of carelessness. Carelessness. All the while, God has given provision for people to be able to enter into His presence. There are different ways you can do. There are requirements you can meet in order to enter. What therefore is sin? Therefore, in the book of Leviticus, sin is someone who is careless with the holy presence of God. Someone who violates God's demands and requirements and take God's holy presence lightly. A person who is careless with the presence of God will be severely judged, because God's presence not only demands purity, it demands attention and care. So that was the object lessons behind all the sacrificial system, as well as the idea of the priest. All the while, the whole concept is that we will need to approach the presence of God with care. You need to approach the presence of God with care simply because He is a holy God. He is a holy God. And that's why the Bible keeps on talking about how with reverence and fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Because the moment you are aware of God's presence and you treat God's presence with care, it will affect all other areas of your life. Whether we approach God with fear, with reverence, with carelessness, all of this depends on how you view God's holiness. This is an important aspect, and in this aspect also that sometimes in modern day we take for granted, because sometimes we overemphasize God's coming near to us without first understanding God's holiness. So this is important. And the whole book of Leviticus start with recognizing the need to approach God's presence with care.